The hallways of Westwood High buzzed with the usual chaos, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, and laughter echoing through the corridors. Among the noise, Luca Moretti walked with his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. He wasn't flashy, no designer clothes, no unnecessary attention, just another transfer student. Quiet, unassuming. At least that's what they thought. Ryan Carter leaned against the lockers, arms crossed, watching Luca with a smirk. He had seen this type before. Loners, the quiet ones who kept their heads down. Easy targets. His crew, a pack of arrogant followers, chuckled as Ryan's smirk widened. "Hey, new kid," he called out. "You lost or just too scared to talk?" Luca didn't flinch. He simply looked at Ryan, his dark eyes calm, unreadable. That silence did something, unsettled Ryan in a way he couldn't explain. He had bullied dozens of kids before, but this one, something was off. Ryan shook it off and stepped closer. "What's with the silent act?" one of his friends sneered. "Too scared to talk?" Luca wasn't scared. He had seen real fear before. Grown men, hands shaking, voices breaking, begging his father for mercy. Compared to that, Ryan and his crew were nothing. But he didn't react, not yet. A deliberate shove. A book knocked from Luca's hands. Murmurs rippled through the hallway, but no one stepped in. Ryan chuckled, his confidence growing. "I think the kid's broken," he laughed. Luca stared at him, his expression unchanged. The silence stretched, making Ryan shift uncomfortably. He had expected anger, fear, something. But Luca gave him nothing. A few feet away, a man leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, watching. His presence blended into the background, unnoticed by the crowd. But his sharp eyes took in every detail. Keanu Reeves had been watching the entire time. The cafeteria at Westwood High was always loud, a chaotic mix of clattering trays, overlapping conversations, and the occasional outburst of laughter. It was a battlefield in its own right, where territories were claimed by athletes, outcasts, and those who simply wanted to get through the day unnoticed. Luca Moretti sat alone, his movement slow, deliberate. He wasn't avoiding anyone, he just preferred the quiet. His father had taught him that silence was power. Observe. Wait. Never act unless necessary. Across the room, Ryan Carter and his crew watched him like a pack of hyenas circling a lone lion. Luca's refusal to react earlier had done something to Ryan, had made him itch for a response. He needed to see Luca flinch, to remind everyone who was in charge. With a smirk, Ryan pushed himself up from his table. "Watch this," he muttered to his friends before striding across the cafeteria, making sure to be loud enough to turn a few heads. "Look at this guy," he said, standing next to Luca's table. "All alone. No friends, no life. Maybe he doesn't even speak English." Laughter erupted from his crew. Luca didn't acknowledge them. He picked up his sandwich, took a slow bite, chewed, swallowed. Ryan's smirk twitched. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He needed a reaction. He needed Luca to feel small. With a sudden, deliberate motion, he grabbed Luca's tray and flipped it. The cafeteria fell silent. Metal clattered against the tile floor. Food smeared across Luca's lap. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every student frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Luca exhaled slowly, his fingers still resting where his tray had been. He looked down at the mess on his clothes, then lifted his gaze to Ryan. No anger, no fear, just silence. For the first time, Ryan hesitated. The cafeteria remained still, dozens of students watching, breath held, expecting an explosion, a shove, a punch, a yell, something. But Luca didn't rise to Ryan's bait. He didn't blink. He simply stood, smooth, controlled, and without a single glance back, he walked away, leaving the mess behind. Ryan forced out a laugh, but it felt hollow. He had expected humiliation, an outburst, anything to cement his dominance. But Luca hadn't given him that, and somehow that was worse. In the far corner of the cafeteria, Keanu Reeves sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving Luca. The kid had control, but for how long? Luca stepped into the empty hallway, his hands still in his pockets, his mind unreadable. The echoes of the cafeteria still lingered behind him, the whispers, the stares, Ryan's forced laughter, trying to cover his own unease. None of it mattered. But as Luca turned the corner, he sensed it. The shift in the air, the slight scuff of shoes behind him. They were following him. He didn't stop, he didn't turn around. Instead, he kept walking, his pace steady, his breathing controlled. His father had always taught him, never react first, never show them what you know. The footsteps behind him quickened. Luca exhaled through his nose. He had given them every chance. A hand clamped down on his shoulder. "You think you're better than us, huh?" Ryan's voice, low and mocking, close. Luca finally stopped. His fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. Not yet. Ryan stepped in front of him, blocking his path. His crew followed, surrounding Luca near the lockers. "Let's try this again," Ryan sneered. "I asked you a question. You deaf or just stupid?" Luca tilted his head slightly. The look in his eyes made Ryan falter for just a second. "What's with that stare?" one of his friends muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Ryan shoved Luca's shoulder. "Say something, tough guy." Silence. Ryan gritted his teeth. "Fine. Maybe you need a little help speaking." His fist swung fast. Luca moved faster. With a slight shift, he dodged the punch effortlessly, letting it slide past his face by an inch. Ryan, caught off balance, stumbled forward. Before he could recover, Luca stepped aside, his movement smooth, controlled, like a predator choosing not to strike just yet. Ryan's crew tensed. Ryan straightened, eyes burning with embarrassment. He knew that wasn't luck. Luca knew how to fight. A second punch came, wilder, angrier. Luca didn't even flinch. He caught Ryan's wrist midair, twisted just enough to send pain shooting up his arm without breaking it. Ryan gasped, his knees almost buckling. Luca held his grip for a moment, long enough for Ryan to understand. I could end this, right now. Then he let go. Ryan staggered back, cradling his wrist. His face was pale now, his confidence shattered. "You don't want this fight," Luca said quietly. For a moment, Ryan hesitated. The hallway was silent. His crew waited for him to do something, anything. Then rage took over reason. "Get him!" Ryan snapped. His friends lunged, and then, "That's enough." The voice was calm, steady, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Ryan's crew froze. Luca didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Keanu Reeves stepped forward from the shadows, his presence shifting the air in an instant. He wasn't angry, he wasn't tense, he simply stood there, watching. And suddenly, the fight was over. The hallway felt smaller now, the tension pressing in from all sides. Ryan's breathing was uneven, his fingers twitching slightly at his side. His crew, once so eager to attack, now stood frozen in place, eyes darting between Luca and the man who had just spoken. Keanu Reeves didn't move from where he stood. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power in the room. Ryan scoffed, masking his uncertainty. "Stay out of this, man," he muttered, shaking off his hesitation. "This doesn't concern you." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering Ryan's words like he was studying an insect under a microscope. Then, with the same unshaken calm, he stepped forward. "Or what?" Keanu asked, his voice dangerously steady. "You gonna throw a punch at me too?" Ryan's mouth opened, but no words came out. His fists clenched at his sides, his pride warring with his instinct to back down. Luca watched carefully, his expression unreadable. This was unexpected. Keanu finally shifted his attention to him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Luca felt like someone truly saw him. "You already know how this ends, don't you?" Keanu asked. Luca didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ryan's fingers twitched again. His pride wouldn't let him walk away, not like this. His friends were watching. The whole school would hear about this. He had to do something, anything. He lunged. Luca took a breath, already anticipating it. The weight shift, the angle of attack, the sloppy aggression. But before he could move, Keanu was already there. One step, one effortless motion. Keanu's hand caught Ryan's arm mid-air and twisted. Not hard, not to hurt him, just enough. Enough to remind Ryan that he was playing in a league he didn't belong to. Ryan gasped, his knees nearly buckling from the unexpected force. Keanu leaned in slightly, his voice still calm, still quiet. "You think this is strength?" he asked. 4 against 1? Ryan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. Keanu sighed, shaking his head. "That's not power," he said. "That's fear." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence. Ryan finally jerked his arm free, staggering back. His chest rose and fell quickly, but his fight was gone. He glanced at his crew, searching for backup, but none of them dared to move. Luca watched, still unmoving. Ryan had always been the one in control, but now he was looking for an exit. And that changed everything. Without another word, Ryan turned sharply on his heel and stormed off. His crew hesitated, then scrambled to follow. Luca exhaled slowly. Not because he was tired, he wasn't, but because he had been moments away from losing control. Keanu must have seen something shift in his expression, because when he turned back to him, his gaze was softer. The school day dragged on, but Luca barely noticed. His mind replayed the hallway confrontation, analyzing every detail, not of the fight, but of Keanu Reeves. Who was this man really? Luca had grown up surrounded by powerful men who spoke in low voices and made others tremble without raising a hand. His father had always told him, "The strongest man in the room is the one who never needs to prove it." Keanu had done exactly that. By the time the final bell rang, Luca had made up his mind. He needed answers. The sun was dipping low in the sky when he spotted him. Keanu stood near the parking lot, leaning against a black motorcycle, hands in his pockets, as if he had been expecting Luca all along. The streetlights flickered to life around them, casting long shadows. Luca walked up, stopping a few feet away. He didn't speak right away, and neither did Keanu. They just watched each other, a silent conversation neither of them needed words for. Finally, Luca broke the silence. "Why did you step in?" Keanu let out a slow breath as if he had been expecting the question. "Because I know what happens next," he said. Luca narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" Keanu looked past him toward the school building. "Bullies like Ryan don't stop. They test limits. And you..." He looked back at Luca, studying him. "You were about to show them exactly who you are." Luca's fingers twitched. He hated how accurate that was. Keanu continued, "You've been taught that power comes from fear, that if you don't act, you lose control." Luca's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I know enough." Silence stretched between them again. The air felt heavy. Keanu finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "What were you going to do if I hadn't shown up?" Luca didn't answer. He had already played the scenario out in his head 100 times. If Keanu hadn't stepped in, Ryan would have left that hallway on his knees. Luca wouldn't have stopped at just teaching a lesson. He would have sent a message. Keanu must have seen something shift in Luca's expression, because he took a slow step forward. "I've seen that look before," he said. Luca's eyes darkened. "From who?" Keanu's lips pressed into a thin line. He hesitated just for a second, just long enough for Luca to notice. Then, in a voice laced with something deeper than just wisdom, he said, "Myself." Luca's breath hitched. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Without another word, he handed it to Luca. Luca hesitated, then took it, unfolding the worn paper with careful fingers. An address. He looked back up, but Keanu was already putting on his helmet. "What's this?" Luca asked. Keanu swung a leg over his motorcycle and glanced at him one last time. "A choice," he said. "If you want answers, come find me." And with that, the engine roared to life, and Keanu Reeves disappeared into the night. Luca stared at the address, his mind racing. He knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow, he was going to find out exactly who Keanu Reeves really was. The address burned in Luca's pocket the entire night. He hadn't unfolded it again, and he didn't need to. His mind was already made up. By morning, he was at the location. It wasn't what he expected. Tucked between abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of the city, the building looked old, forgotten. A rusted-out "closed for renovation" sign hung crookedly over the door, but something about it felt deliberate. Luca didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood, the faintest scent of coffee lingering somewhere. Light filtered through high windows, casting golden streaks across the concrete floor. Then, a voice. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up." Luca turned. Keanu stood near a wooden table, casually pouring himself a cup of coffee. He didn't look surprised to see him. He didn't even turn fully, just gestured toward an empty chair. "Sit," Keanu said. Luca didn't move. "What is this place?" Keanu took a slow sip before answering. "A place for people like you." Luca's brows furrowed. "People like me?" Keanu finally turned to face him, setting his cup down. His expression was unreadable. People standing at a crossroads, people deciding whether they want to become what the world expects, or something else. Luca's jaw tightened. "You don't know me." Keanu smirked just slightly. "I know enough." Silence stretched between them. The air felt heavy, charged. Luca wasn't sure why, but he sat. Keanu leaned back against the table, studying him. "Your father," he said after a moment. "Matteo Moretti. Big name. Bigger shadow." Luca's shoulders tensed. Keanu continued. "A name that makes people lower their voices. A name that gets things done." Luca kept his expression unreadable, but his fingers curled slightly against his knee. Keanu's eyes flicked to the movement. He noticed everything. "Let me guess," Keanu said. "He taught you to strike first, or not at all?" Luca exhaled through his nose. "He taught me not to waste my time." Keanu nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. "And yet, you didn't hit Ryan." Luca's lips pressed together. Keanu tilted his head. "Why?" Luca's fingers twitched. He wasn't sure if it was restraint or frustration, maybe both. Keanu let the silence stretch, then finally, he pushed himself off the table. "You've spent your whole life in the shadow of your father's power. And now, for the first time, you're starting to wonder." He paused, locking eyes with Luca. If that power is really yours." Luca felt his pulse in his ears. He didn't answer, didn't need to. Keanu picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, then placed the cup down with a soft clink. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," he said. "I'm just here to remind you." He held Luca's gaze. "You always have a choice." Luca swallowed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what that choice was, and that terrified him. The weight of Keanu's words settled in Luca's chest like a stone. You always have a choice. For years, he had never questioned it. His path had always been laid out for him. Power, control, fear. That was what his father had built. That was what Luca was meant to inherit. But now, for the first time, doubt crept in. Keanu watched him, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, walking toward a dusty shelf in the corner of the room. "You've been taught that strength is about making people fear you," he said, running his fingers over the books stacked haphazardly. "That the only way to survive is to be the one people are afraid of." Luca remained silent. Keanu grabbed an old book and flipped through the pages, then spoke again, his tone softer. But tell me this, does your father fear anyone? Luca's jaw tightened. No. Keanu glanced up. Are you sure? Luca's fingers curled into fists. I said, Keanu cut him off. Then why does he work so hard to make sure everyone else fears him? Luca froze. Keanu closed the book and set it down. Real power isn't about making people tremble when they hear your name, he said. It's about something bigger than that. Luca scoffed, leaning back in his chair. And what's that? Keanu smirked. You already know. Luca exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know what you expect from me, Keanu shrugged. Nothing. He took another sip of coffee, then added, but I know what you expect from yourself, and that's what scares you. Luca didn't respond. Keanu sighed, then picked up a set of keys from the table. Come on. Luca frowned. Where? Keanu just smiled. You'll see. Luca hesitated, but then, without fully understanding why, he stood up and followed. The ride was quiet. Keanu drove with the kind of ease that came from experience, his motorcycle weaving through the city streets like he had done it 1,000 times. Luca sat behind him, arms crossed, watching the world blur past. He had no idea where they were going, but something told him he needed to find out. Finally, they pulled up to a dimly lit parking lot outside a small, unmarked building, the kind of place people didn't notice unless they were looking for it. Keanu killed the engine and stepped off the bike. Come on, he said. Luca followed him inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of sweat and adrenaline. The distant thud of fists hitting a punching bag echoed through the space. As Luca's eyes adjusted, he realized where they were. A gym. But not just any gym. A fight gym. Keanu walked forward, nodding at a few people as he passed. Some of them looked up, recognizing him instantly. No one said anything. No one had to. Luca followed, his muscles coiled with tension. What is this? Keanu stopped in front of an empty ring and turned. This, he said, is where people learn the difference between power and strength. Luca narrowed his eyes. And what am I supposed to learn here? Keanu smirked. Guess we'll find out. A low voice interrupted them. You're late. Luca turned. A man stood near the ring, wrapping his hands with slow, practiced movements. His build was solid, a fighter. His gaze flicked over Luca, assessing him with quiet interest. Keanu grinned. Luca, meet an old friend of mine. He gestured toward the fighter. This is Marco. Luca's eyes stayed locked on Marco's. There was something in the way he stood, the way he watched. Like a man who had already seen the end of a fight before it had even started. Keanu clapped a hand on Luca's shoulder. Hope you're ready, he said. Luca frowned. Ready for what? Keanu's smile widened. For your first lesson,